Okay, good morning. Welcome to the latest Dapr Dev community call. Let me just display the agenda here so we can see what the agenda is for today. Today we're going to start off with a little demo from Phil from the Cloud Tools team, and he's going to show us about VS Code containers, dev containers. Then Jeroen is going to do a demo on Dapr metrics. Both of these are sort of preview features, are sort of early looks about what we're doing. I'll talk a little bit about what we're doing with the releases, what we've done with 4.0, talk about some of the community engagement that's happened, and then we have plenty of time for anyone to ask questions and open up. Feel free to ask any question that you want, as simple or as complex as you desire. No question, cannot be asked. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm going to hand it over to Phil and let him introduce himself and to talk about the VS Code dev containers.
Hello, my name's Phil Hoff. I'm on the team responsible for just about all of the container-related tooling across Visual Studio for Code, and Visual Studio for Mac. In particular, we own such extensions like the Docker extension for VS Code. It's where I spend a lot of my time. And I've also been doing a lot of Dapr-related development, app building, and then so on. So one of the things I want to talk about today is how you might manage development of Dapr applications across the various platforms that you might be developing Dapr applications on, in particular with Visual Studio Code. So let me start sharing my screen. Just let me get a moment for that to come up.
That's good, we can see it.
Okay, great. All right, so I've got just sort of a made up sample application. It consists of two services. One is a typical .NET Core based web API application. It follows a lot of the samples that you might have seen related to Dapr. It's just basic bank accounting kind of application. And then I have a Node.js service, which is listening for events published by the .NET Core application and just responds to them in a very basic way. So one way I could develop both sides of this multi-service application in VS Code is simply to install or to pull in both repos on my single local machine, install the Dapr runtime, install .NET Core, the right version of .NET Core, install the right version of Node.js, get everything working, start both applications, and hopefully everything works. And that's great for myself and my own personal development, but it doesn't necessarily help the rest of my team who might need to do similar setup on their own machines. So Visual Studio Code has this concept called dev containers. And basically, it allows you to define your environment and all the things that make up that environment for the development of within a particular repo. And that gets expressed as a Docker container. So that when that Docker container runs, VS Code basically installs itself in that container and then allows you to edit, develop, run, debug, test, whatever, your application within that container as if it was running locally. So one of the things I want to show you is how that works sort of within the context of Dapr. So as I've said, I've got two applications. Here's my .NET Core application. It's a basic web API, just a couple of endpoints. And what we want to do is we want to create a dev container for this. One of the things that we've done is we've created a Dapr-enabled dev container template for VS Code. So within VS Code, we can go and create a new dev container for this repo. So we'll go execute the command. We'll say add development container configuration files. And then we have this long list of the different kinds of sort of environments that we might want to base our environment on. We'll search for Dapr, and there are two sort of pre-built templates for us. There's one for using Dapr with .NET Core, and one for using Dapr with Node.js. So for this repo, we'll say .NET Core. And so what it's going to do, it just pulled down some files. These get checked in as part of your repo so that anybody else that is working within this repo gets the same dev environment that we're defining here. And it will work exactly the same on their machine as it works on my machine. So we'll go ahead and we'll go reopen that in that new dev container. So one of the things that we'll see is happening is it's actually going and it's using the Docker file that was pulled down to build this base image. That base image will install the Docker CLI, it'll install the Dapr CLI, it will then initialize the Dapr runtime within a private network, so that's completely isolated from my local machine. So now it's reopened that same repo, but within the context of the dev container. And now we have a .NET Core development environment that's completely isolated. Okay, so we'll go over to our Node.js application. You can see this exposes some basic endpoints. It exposes a listener for a couple of Dapr events, and then responds to them just right into the console. So we'll do a similar thing here. We'll reopen, or we'll add development container configuration files. This time we'll choose the Dapr with Node.js template. And it's going to do something very similar. We'll say reopen that within the container. Now it's using a different, or a somewhat similar but different Docker file to create a Node.js based container, and then it will reopen that repo within the context of that dev container. So now we'll have a completely isolated Node.js development environment that is also Dapr enabled. And so that'll take a couple of moments to spin up. All right, so that's spun up. So let's go ahead and now we want to be able to test. But one of the good things about dev containers is that they can work within the same Docker network. So even though they're completely isolated development environments, they're on the same Docker network, which means they can talk to each other. So now we can have two Dapr-enabled applications built on completely separate platforms and stacks that can still communicate with each other, just as if they were on your local machine. So here we go, and we'll start the Dapr app. The Dapr run, ID, node. We'll start our Node app, and we'll see that it started within the context of Dapr. And we'll do the same thing on the .NET side. Let's see, Dapr run. And we'll start up the .NET application within the context of Dapr. Oh no, I forgot one thing. Okay, we'll fix that. All right, this is a short-term quirk that we need to switch to the .NET Core 3.0 environment. But we can easily do that. We'll say go rebuild our environment. That's one nice thing about dev containers is you have access to the Docker file, and you can simply make whatever tweaks that you want to it and start it up again and customize it as you wish.
So Phil, to confirm, this is Mike, I work with Phil. You changed the base image in the Docker file that's actually building that dev container, right?
That is true. With the latest 0.4 version of Dapr, which was just released, for .NET apps, it requires the corresponding 0.4 version of the ASP.NET SDK. And that is now tied to .NET Core 3.1. So you can no longer use it with .NET Core 3.0, which means that the template needs to be updated that VS Code is using, which I submitted a PR for yesterday, and it was merged today. So soon you won't have to do this on your own, but at least for the immediate time being, you'll need to switch to 3.1. All right. So let's go ahead and we'll just restart that. Restart that. And now we'll do.
One other quick question, Phil, while you're doing this. You mentioned that these two dev containers, which are running Node.js in one and .NET in the other, they're both on the same Docker network. And that's just a configuration that you put into the template so that would be the case. Is that correct?
Right. So both of the templates just out of the box use the same separate Docker network, with the idea being is that you're typically, or the thought being that you're typically going to be developing, even if you're developing applications across multiple stacks, you're doing so within the context of the same application. So you kind of want them to automatically be able to talk to one another.
And of course, if that wasn't the case, I could just change the Docker network that the dev container is spun up on, right?
Right, so you have access to the Docker Compose YAML here, which is used by the dev container, as well as the Docker file, so you have control over pretty much every aspect of how that dev container gets built and spun up.
Awesome, thanks.
All right, so now we have both applications running. So now we'll go, and one last thing that we'll need to do is, because these are separate containers, we actually need to forward the Dapr port that's on the .NET app, because that's the one that we want to talk to. So now we're forwarding the port that the Dapr runtime is running on, so that we can use it as sort of a proxy to our application. So now we'll go to Postman, and we'll call through Dapr. So you can see we're calling through the Dapr port, through the Dapr API sort of syntax and its endpoint. And we'll go basically try and execute a method on our .NET app. And you can see we got back at 200. See, we deposited some funds in the account. We can see in the console that we did in fact hit our .NET app. You can see it handling that request. And we can also see that after this .NET app made its Dapr publication, we can see that the Node.js app, which was listening for those publications, now responded to the publication coming in from Dapr. And we can go and we can do this a couple more times, and you can see that even though we're testing locally, it's actually hitting both isolated apps running in completely separate Docker containers. All right, so that is about all I have for demoing dev containers with Dapr and VS Code. Obviously, as you know, right now, as I mentioned before, we support out of the box .NET Core and Node.js. But if there's support for other platforms, whether it's Java, Python, Go, or whatever, we're certainly interested in knowing about that and creating sort of similar Dapr dev container templates for those. Okay, that's all I have.
That's fantastic, Phil. Does anyone have any questions they want to ask Phil about this? Either yeah, go ahead.
Okay, where are the containers running?
So the containers are running on my local machine, or I should say wherever in whichever Docker host environment that you have configured from your machine. So in this case, I'm running Docker locally, and that's where all of the Docker containers are running. So you can see here is the .NET Core dev container. So this is the container that's actually hosting the .NET Core side of the app. Here's the one that's hosting the Node side. And here are the Dapr runtime containers that are in that separate Docker network that is actually hosting the Dapr runtime and the state store, for example.
Oh, cool. Thanks.
Yeah, so in other words, you're creating a local development environment using Docker containers that's reproducible.
Exactly. You can spin up those dev containers. You don't have to pollute your host. In this case, Phil's running Docker Desktop on his local machine. If Phil wanted to, he could point his daemon to a remote Docker daemon, right, Phil? If you wanted to run these containers remote also.
There may be some limitations around that, but in general, yes, any Docker host that you can reach locally, your dev container should be able to run in that same Docker host.
But yeah, the big advantage here is as long as I'm running Docker Desktop, I can do a git clone on Phil's repo. Down along with the code comes the definition of that dev container. When I open that repo up in VS Code, it notices that there's a dev container.json file and offers to open that dev container up for me. If it needs to, it will build it. And so without polluting my machine or taking the time to set up all the Daprisms, the runtime, the CLI, this all kind of happens automatically in a container. If I want to get rid of it all, I remove the container, and now I'm back to a pristine environment. So it's really flexible and really clean.
And I think another thing worth mentioning, Phil, is like if you do upgrades from Dapr version 3 to version 4, you can easily upgrade the containers. Is that right?
That's right. You saw how all I had to do was make a tweak to the Docker file and then basically rebuild the container, the dev container, and now I've got a new base image with all of the new stuff in it. The way that the Docker file is authored with respect to Dapr is it just runs the Dapr installation. So every time the container is rebuilt, it should pull down the latest version of the Dapr runtime and CLI. So that would be 0.4 as of a couple days ago. So when 0.5 is released, 0.6, on and on, you'll just rebuild the container and you should get a new base image with those new CLI and runtimes on it.
Okay, that's fantastic.
And of course, if there were other tools that that Phil hasn't included in the Docker file that folks want to customize, you can of course add your own logic to that Docker file and install any other tools you want into that dev container. And then also extensions. In fact, Phil's showing that in the dev container JSON, you can also identify additional extensions to install automatically, and VS Code will do that for you. And Phil's showing that area of the JSON.
Yeah. So if you have your own favorite list of here are all the extensions that I are must-haves for my development environment, you can simply make that add it to this extensions list in the dev container JSON. And now every time you open that dev container, all of those extensions will be automatically installed and ready to go for you as soon as you open the repo.
And these containers are now public, these two, the Node.js one and the C# one, and people can go and try them out?
Right, yeah. So as of the last, I think, 1.42 version of VS Code, those two dev container templates are available just within VS Code. As we add more, they get rolled out with each successive version of VS Code. But even if you wanted, if we added additional ones, even before that next version rolls out, all these dev templates are open source. They're in a VS Code dev containers repo. You can simply copy the dev container folder from that repo for whichever template you want, right into your own repo and just use it that way as well. So there's a couple different ways to sort of get at these dev containers.
Great. If you want people to give you feedback after this, what's the best way?
That's a good question. We don't have a specific repo for it, but
that's fine. They can do it on the Dapr Gitter alias.
Yeah, that might work best. That might work best for right now.
Okay, we'll do it on the Dapr Gitter channel and just ask questions there, and we'll monitor that and post them through. Okay. Fantastic. All right. So with that, thank you, Phil. That was great. We're going to move now on to our second demo, where Jeroen's going to show us how we install Dapr and use metrics. So, Jeroen.
Thank you, Mark. I will share my screen. All right, let me know if you can see my terminal.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, good. So today we're gonna take a look at a feature which is currently in master branch and not in 0.4. It's matrix. That PR was contributed by Johnny Collins, so thanks, Johnny. And what we're gonna take a look at today is matrix that are being exposed from inside of Dapr, and take a look at a few interesting things that we can do with them. So first of all, I have a Kubernetes cluster here, which is just running Redis really, and I've got Prometheus running inside the Prometheus namespace. So I can take a look at the pods running here. And the way I installed Prometheus was just to do helm install for the stable version of Prometheus installed into the Prometheus namespace. So nothing too fancy here. So that basically was the setup work for what you're about to see. The next thing I did was install Dapr with a Docker image that I built off of master branch, so not 0.4.0 again. And this is running inside the Dapr system namespace here. So let's take the distributed calculator example, which we all know and love, and it's sort of become the go-to app for demos. So for those of you who don't know it, it's basically a calculator that does its operations with different microservices written in 4 different languages. So we have subtraction, to divide, multiply, and to add all different microservices within the cluster. So this is Kubernetes deployment, for example, for the subtract app written in C#, and it has the Dapr annotations, giving it the Dapr ID, telling Dapr to inject the sidecar with a port. And I have something new here, which is Prometheus, and this basically tells Prometheus to scrape the cluster. Now, in order to get Matrix from Dapr, I don't need that installed, because Dapr for now will expose a Matrix endpoint, which you or any other system can just scrape if they want to. But Prometheus uses those endpoints to basically pull the Matrix from the different pod instances they're running in the cluster. So with no further ado, let's just deploy what's in here. All right, so I created those deployments, and they should be up and running in a sec. Okay, so we can see that everything's running. And if we take a look at the logs of one of those pods and take a look at Dapr, we can see that now we have a Matrix server running on port 9090. That's the default port that Dapr will be serving Matrix on. And this can actually be changed by doing dapr.io /matrix port, and then giving it any other port which you may want to list on. For example, this is useful if your application is exposing Matrix also on port 99, and you don't want to have that collide with Dapr's Matrix endpoints. You can have your app serving and a Matrix endpoint in a different port, and you can have Dapr serving it on the port of your choice. So now let's try and port forward to this application. Whoops, not that. I'll get the pod name, and I will port forward to it. And I will port forward to port 9090, which is the Matrix server port. And now what I can do is go to my browser, type in localhost, not localhost 9090. No. 90, yeah. And we can see all the matrix. And this is quite cool. So those are all the matrix that are exposed from Dapr. We're not going to go into each and every one of those. Of course, we're going to have docs specifying exactly which matrix supports, which matrix Dapr supports and emits. But basically, this is how you can scrap Dapr. So those are matrix that are formatted using the Prometheus text data format. So now let's go back to our cluster and port forward to our calculator service. And this is port 5000. And yes, Dapr is stateful. So this is the request from the last time I ran the demo. And now I'm going to do a bunch of requests, basically to just get some matrix going. So I'm going to divide and add and multiply. I've done this so many times for demos. Yeah. Okay, and I'm going to do a multiplication just a little bit, a little more. Okay, and yeah, I think that's it. Let's just do sum for divide. Okay, and we have a bunch of commands that were being dispatched for all those microservices. And what I'm going to do now is port forward to Prometheus so that we can start taking a look at what those metrics look like in Prometheus. So we're now running on 3000. And this is Prometheus. And if I take a look, all of those are matrix that are emitted by different pods and components running inside of Kubernetes. So what we get with Dapr basically are things called gRPC client and server and HTTP handler. So we're going to have docs about each and every one of these, but a few nice things that we can actually take a look at. For example, we can take a look at HTTP handler completed requests. And what this is going to show us are all the HTTP invocations that arrive to a Dapr instance. So what we can see is that those are HTTP requests for the app with an idea of calculator front-end. So this is the Dapr sidecar for the calculator front-end app. We have some metadata with the local host that we used when this call was made. We have the Kubernetes namespace here. We have the pod name, and then we have the path that was called, which is nice. So, this is Prometheus. So for example, if I wanted to see all the HTTP calls for the multiply service, I could basically do something like this, path, and close this and execute. And we can see that we had 5 calls for the multiply app. And then this is Prometheus, of course, so you can have also types of queries, ranged queries and scalar queries on top of those matrix, and you can also create graphs. And in addition to number of requests, we also have latency. So latency and requests are something that are pretty good to basically drive auto-scaling decisions, and you could drive the CADA auto-scaling decisions using these matrix in the CADA Prometheus autoscaler. So you can actually have CADA autoscaling your Dapr instances based on the number of incoming requests per second, or even latency based scaling. So with Dapr, with CADA, you can put up any Prometheus query. So you can do something like if my multiply application is responding in less than 50 milliseconds, in 2 minutes, scale it out by 5 pods. And that might be a demo that we're going to do later on. And then we have the gRPC stats, and those are quite interesting because those actually show you the Dapr runtime matrix for incoming requests for each and every one of the Dapr APIs. So let's take a look at something that's called gRPC server handled. And we'll execute that, and we get a whole bunch of matrix here. So if you take a look at how this is basically done is we can filter by an application, by the gRPC code. So we have all the gRPC codes and with a gRPC method. So let's say that we want to take a look at all the multiply matrix for the multiply app, and take a look at the gRPC code for success, which is OK. And we'll execute that. And you can see that we have all the time series data matrix endpoints here. So we had 5 calls for the multiply service. They all ended up in OK. And if we look at all the other ones, we can see that we also have matrix for the calling actor method, delete state, get state, basically the entirety of the Dapr API. And also we can, for example, create a graph here and have it stacked. And yeah, take a look at that. Actually, we can discover some pretty nice things with the HTTP handler. Let's take a look, for example, at completed latency. So we'll execute that, and we'll go down to a resolution of, let's say, 15 minutes. And so we get a stacked view, so we can see what took longer. And we can basically literally walk up and down the stack of the time series data points. So we can see that calling the state store took the longest in this case, and then calling the subtract application. Yeah. So those are all nice things. And we love to hear your thoughts about which other types of matrix you'd like to see. Latency and number of requests per second are nice. They're like the things that you get with most service meshes, for example. And then being able to actually view all the Dapr runtime gRPC methods and filter by them, with status codes and the applications is also quite nice. So if you want to see more matrix, just open up more issues. And this is the demo. So thank you.
That's fantastic. So you talked about HTTP requests. Does it show latency to the backend stores in the component stores as well?
Yes.
So
yeah. So that's quite interesting because you can drive really interesting scaling decisions, right? You can basically say scale my application if my Redis state store is taking longer than X to respond, or things like that.
Yeah, actually, that's what I was getting to. and you can see the time it takes for one particular store over another to see if
Correct. This is really useful.
Yes. And same for all the other components will happen like that as well. So if I do it across pub sub queues as well, will I get
Correct.
those?
That's correct. That's correct.
So we'll probably come back. Do you have to do anything special in that when you're a component author or not?
No.
Okay, good stuff. So let's give a chance to ask some questions on that. If anyone get questions asked about the metrics capabilities and things, I'm sure we'll come back to it again in some future when this was just simply a preview because it's just been added in now. I'm sure we'll come back and revisit it and look at it again when we put it to some in a release, which will probably be the 0.50 release. Any questions on that?
Correct.
My question is, do you plan to support SF metrics and health subsystem? We haven't done the Service Fabric team, going back to Dapr running on Service Fabric. Service Fabric team is still working out when and how they'll support Service Fabric on Dapr, so we're still working through that one with them. But yes, they could potentially do that, and the health subsystem as well. It's a good topic. One we'll take up with the Service Fabric team. But you can ask that on their community call that they have this week on Thursday. That very question. Okay, so before I open up to questions, let me just share a few things here myself, and then we'll go through some of the questions. I wanted to just share what's been happening, some things inside the community. Just so you're aware, we released the 0.4 Dapr runtime and the 0.2 Java SDK last week. If you saw the Twitter feed about them, then you can go and download them, and these are now our latest supported releases. So that was we're pretty excited by this. In terms of other things that's been happening, if you didn't, I did a talk last week on Azure Community Live. You can see the URL down here on azurecommunity.live, and that was just showed sort of demos and outline of what Dapr is. Feel free to go and listen to that. On Friday of last week, we had Joe Bader from VMware do a TGI Kubernetes Friday, and he spent an hour and a half running through installing Dapr from scratch and debugging issues and building out apps and basically getting himself familiar. It was quite fun to watch because he knew nothing about it beforehand. So you see someone completely from scratch go through our docs, go through Dapr and install the apps and get them up and running on different types of Kubernetes clusters in his case. So I recommend you check this out. It was kind of a fun thing to listen to if you have an hour and a half. In terms of a couple of other articles, the New Stack published a couple on Dapr, which is worth looking at. One which was just an overview, and one tutorial here on doing Dapr on Kubernetes. So those were some things we did inside the community and I'll post these URLs in the chat window. As always, these sessions will all get recorded and placed up on our Dapr YouTube channel. So at this point, I'm going to hand it over. I see there's some questions in the chat window. I'm going to stop sharing at this point. I see there's some questions in the chat window. Some of them may have been answered already, but feel free to either post some new ones or repost some of the existing ones. I'll try and pick out some of these ones to read out, or maybe someone who's answered them already, your own, or Young Boo, might be worth talking if you've answered some of them already. But feel free to open up your mic or post some new questions now. And we've got 20 minutes to do whatever you want to talk about on Dapr. I see there was I see there was an earlier conversation about supporting secrets. Is that, do you want to summarize that question if I go back to it?
Yeah, so this really ties to what we've been seeing from a lot of people asking, basically, if they can have an API where they ask Dapr for secrets, right? So that people don't have to use things like init containers that talk to a secret store and then mount them on the pod, or just basically abstract away all the secret fetching logic from the developer.
Yes, yeah. We've seen this asked quite a few times actually. And yeah, we're going to make that a pretty seamless experience so that if you can just pull down secrets from your external key secret store, it'll be very useful. We've just seen a number of customers who simply just built their own secrets management infrastructure which we can now easily put into Dapr because we already have that connectivity. Okay, here's a question from George. Will Dapr support Azure Functions and Drupal functions out of the box, no containers? And if so, will it happen sooner rather than later? Well, the answer to that is we're still working through it. The answer is there's no direct integration with functions at this point in time, but we're having great conversations with the functions team about this. Right now, you can take the functions runtime and, in terms of deploying that into your own environment, say for example into as a container image into your own Kubernetes cluster, there is actually one of the samples that we have that shows functions calling onto the pub sub capabilities inside Dapr, so you can do a pub sub message between functions. So that's sort of hosted in your own runtime inside your own environment, like inside your own Kubernetes cluster. What we're looking at is, what does it mean for Dapr to be supported, in Azure Functions, the service? We don't have any answers to that just yet, but look for more as we get to the later half of this year. So it'll be later rather than sooner, in the sense of we don't have an immediate plan right now, but we're having lots of conversations.
Yeah, and George, if you want to ask the Azure Functions guys if they plan to add Dapr integration from their side, that'd be great.
Yes.
I would like to talk more about the Dapr observability, which will be improved in 0.4.0, 5.0 in the next version of the Dapr. Can I?
Yeah, yes, go ahead. Youngbo.
Yeah, we created the observability, the label. So if you filter by observability label, and then you can see all the work items that we will do for the Dapr observability. So as you can see, the Yaron's demo, Johnny contributed a lot for the, Johnny is the external contributor, contributed a lot for the metrics. So we were planning to improve our logs and traits as well. So if you take a look at this proposal, we provide a kind of the outline of how we will improve the observability, including metric, logs, and the traits as well. So if you are interested in this observability improvement, please be contributed to that as well.
And have you posted the issue? Yes, you have, inside the chat window. Great. Richard asks, sort of on the same note, there's a plan to bundle CADA at some point, since it's a natural companion to Dapr bindings. Or Dapr, but yes, you're right. Dapr and CADA and any service meshes all go very well together in a natural bundle of stuff. And it's certainly something that people keep asking, is like, is there an installer that you can have where we could take an environment like a Kubernetes environment and deploy CADA and Dapr and a service mesh to it all together? And I think that's a very good idea. I think that's something that you'll probably see us think about a little bit more, so that rather than you have to build that environment yourself. But we're not doing anything planned at the moment. At the moment, it's kind of you have to go and put that all together yourself, but we're making sure that we work very well with all of these components. So as your own showed with making sure metrics and CADA and Dapr all work very well together. And we're doing the same with service meshes.
Yeah, Dapr and CADA work really well together. And again, it's pretty straightforward to install either one of them with Helm. So it's just a Helm install CADA, Helm install Dapr. Yeah. So that shouldn't be too much work to put those two together.
Yeah, I think it's good. We'll probably start with some docs first around that. Yes, it's good to know a Rio-esque experience would be awesome. Easy sell. Agreed. Phil just replied saying that VS Code currently doesn't have any Kubernetes integration with dev containers, but it's interesting to think about. I presume, Phil, you mean with the VS Code, with the VS Code extension, do you?
Richard had a question about whether or not you could use, or you could have sort of a similar development experience, but have those containers running within the context of, say, a local Kubernetes. environment as opposed to, you know, a more raw Docker-based environment. At the moment, there isn't any Kubernetes integration with VS Code dev containers, but it's something interesting to think about how that might work.
Yeah, that's a great idea, actually. Marcin, last thing, this application gateway ingress controller thing is the pass thing I'm actually missing for Dapr to go live. Marcin, are you asking about how we make sure that we get Dapr working with application gateway? We haven't tried it, but it should just work.
Yeah. What actually I'm looking for is, yeah, because we have great experience with MTLS already with service-to-service communication, right?
Yes.
And the only thing that I'm missing is the ingress thing, to expose a service to the world and to avoid certificate management for my services.
I see.
So I was thinking about two options, about forwarding invocation endpoint to the ingress, exposing it as ingress resource, or another option I was thinking is to implement a HTTP input binding, which would cause Dapr sidecar to listen on an additional port and forward traffic like a standard binding, input binding. So, and in each case, I need to have encryption. So I need to have a streamlined trust relationship between application gateway ingress controller and Dapr, and have no idea how to do this for now.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it's something that we should spend some time on as well, making sure that we get good ingress controllers deployed and how they hook up to Dapr. So
and I believe that it would be easier with classic ingress controllers because you can then deploy, for example, with Nginx, because then you can deploy Dapr sidecar together with a classic ingress controller, right?
Yes.
In Nginx. But for application gateway, which will be powering the serverless, nodeless version of AKS, then I see no such option. So this is where what I'm trying to solve now.
I think that's a great question. I think it's something that we'll put some time into as well over the next few weeks. People are asking more about how we integrate with other solutions, and I think it's important now that we got Dapr to a solid, base runtime with features that we start to talk about how we integrate with some of the other ingress gateways, including services inside Azure. So let's spend some time thinking about this, and we'll probably raise some issues and start having a conversation inside the repo.
Yeah, for sure.
I think a similar thing with API management as well. I think that's been asked quite a bit as well. How does Dapr integrate with API management?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So
Yeah.
Thank you very much. I need to run.
Okay.
Great call. Great stuff. Thank you.
All right.
Bye.
Richard asks ingress to Dapr and Dapr to service mesh. Dapr is definitely the biggest missing spot for the docs. For me, we're considering Glue plus Clada plus Dapr plus Linkerd and plus OM as it matures architecture in essence. Yes, I think you're hitting the nail on the head, Richard, here is that, we got to get these integration points now across these other technologies, things like Clada and service mesh, to see an ingress that Marcin arrayed, so we can understand how this all fits together nicely and easier, I should say.
Yeah, we already have some pretty good docs and samples about Clada. We should definitely have for things like SMI and Linkerd and Istio.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, any more questions? While we're waiting, anyone posting the questions, now that we've released our 0.4 runtime, we're actually going to be spending time this week looking at what's the next set of capabilities and features that we're going to focus on. Having calls like this is great to help us focus on some of the important things. So please look at some of the issues inside the Dapr repo, upvote things that are important to you. Join in some of the conversations. When we get to the next community call, which will be in 2 weeks' time, I'll probably do a little summary of where we think we're going to be taking and what we're going to be doing inside the 0.5 runtime. and also the supporting SDKs as well, because we're trying to make sure that the SDKs, like we did with the Java one, like we've done with the .NET C# one, have added capabilities inside them as well. So you'll see focusing on all the repos, the CLI, the Dapr runtime, and the SDK runtimes. So in 2 weeks' time, we'll come back and have a little review of here's where we think we heard, here's where we think we're going to focus on for the 0.5 runtime, and inside the other SDKs. So this week is a great opportunity for you to kind of dive in to look at the issues and upvote them for things that you think are important. If there aren't any more questions, then we'll close the call.
Thanks, everyone.
Last opportunity, I think we're done. Okay, thanks everyone, and see you on the 2nd of March. The next one will be, 3rd of March. It'll be 2 weeks today. The 3rd of March will be the next community call that we'll have. Thanks everyone.
And by the way, we'll have some really cool stuff in VS Code to show.
Yes. Yeah, it'll be a good call in 2 weeks' time. There'll be more VS Code stuff. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.